So, when Warner Brothers shelved Batgirl and Peter Safran said the film was not releasable, a lot of us wondered, how bad could it be? Well, now I know. I've never seen a movie this bad. I mean, this is shocking. And we've all seen some bad movies. But this one, I think that most people would agree, even fans, that Madame Web is also not releasable. I mean, to be fair, I don't know if Batgirl was this bad, but I didn't think a movie could be this bad. And I'm surprised that nobody at Sony, especially after Warner Brothers did it, said, maybe we should, take the same exit on this movie. In fact, while I was watching the movie, my body tried to shut down in self-defense mode. It was like, don't watch it, Grace! And it tried to put me to sleep. And I wasn't even tired. I mean, I know the Super Bowl was the other night, but I got enough sleep. I mean, it was my screening was in the middle of the afternoon, but my eyes were just like, go to sleep, Grace. I had to fight to stay awake to see the end of this movie. And one of the things that helped keep me awake while I was watching Madame Web was the laughter coming from the other critics as they laughed at the movie. Now, I really don't like when people laugh at movies, because, even if you think they did a horrible job, an effort was made, and it's really bad for the industry that this movie is so bad. It's bad for the comic book genre. It's bad for women in superhero movies. I mean, this is a problem. So there's really not anything funny about it. But the movie's so bad, I can't really blame anybody for laughing at it. But to me, I found it very, very frustrating and inexplicable that the movie even existed. All right, so Madame Web is an origin story of Cassandra Web, and a pre-origin story, I didn't even know those existed, for 3 SpiderWomen, all 3 of them, whose super short superhero scenes you've pretty much already seen in the trailer, which is incredible to me. Like, you don't tell an origin story unless the character puts on the costume, like at least by halfway through the movie, usually at the end of the first act. Right? Or some kind of version of what their costume is going to be. But I mean, the reason they haven't used any of the costumes to advertise the movie is because nobody ever really gets into costume. What? I know! There's no end credits scene. We all waited to check. No end credits scene. The Easter eggs are far and few between. And when they do show up, teeny tiny and inconsequential. Madame Web is the least connected to the source material. Forget the other Sony SpiderMan verse movies. It's the least connected to the source material of any comic book property to date. And it plays like nobody associated with this film bothered to read a single comic book all the way through, much less study them. It's like, do you guys know what this movie is based on? It's incredible. Cassandra Web does have the most complete storyline, and she does, by the end of the movie, somewhat reflect the character from the comics. You're like, oh yeah, I can see it, but here it comes across as ridiculous. You're like, that didn't work out at all. Also, the movie has very strong Birds of Prey vibes. And Birds of Prey, by the way, there's now 2 not great, well, I didn't care for the Birds of Prey movie because it wasn't Birds of Prey. And now like an awful movie that are similar to that group of characters. But that's a great freaking comic, or at least it has been. Right now, it's amazing. They just recently relaunched it. It's phenomenal. But here, though, this was like CW Birds of Prey. And then you have an all-female team and a leader who eventually, as you can see from the comics, is paralyzed. Although, but in the comics, it's such a more important and well-done commentary on superheroes who can still save the world despite maybe some of the limitations they find themselves having to deal with. But here, I mean, it was just for show. But again, as I said, Birds of Prey on the CW. Like, they even kind of at the end had like that like little clubhouse. I was like, that looks like the same freaking location. The whole movie seems like a bad CW show, which makes sense because get this is the first feature directed by S.J. Clarkson, who comes from a background in television shows and streaming shows. Now, some directors who come from streaming are excellent. There are some streaming directors that we just can't wait to make the leap to feature films. But S.J. Clarkson, unfortunately, ain't one of them. She has directed some Marvel Netflix shows, which is clearly why she got this gig. And Madam Web does play very much like an episode of Jessica Jones. In fact, Kristen Ritter and Dakota Johnson even have a similar look. But this would be like if Jessica Jones was not at all comics accurate, took place in broad daylight, and featured some awful writing and acting. Like, woo! Clarkson, by the way, is unfortunately a co-writer on this film as well. But get this. This, to me, is the most amazing thing. Clarkson is now developing a track record of not releasable work. She was the one in charge of the Naomi Watts Game of Thrones spin-off show, a couple of pictures leaked recently. And she not only oversaw the development of the show, but she directed the pilot. And the pictures have looked okay. And I'm sure, again, some of us were like, how bad could it be? Well, when you see Madam Web, you will understand. And what do you know? HBO watched that pilot and decided the show was not releasable. Oh my goodness. S.J. Clarkson, that's going to become her middle name. So if not already. You know, I think that Venom, the first one, might have been one of the worst things to ever happen to Sony because it was so successful. And I liked that movie. I liked it for what it was. But it gave Sony the idea that they could make a bunch of Spider-Man-less movies with his supporting cast. And you just can't do that. Most of these characters were never meant to be leads. They were designed to play off of Spider-Man and to expand his world. So to see them on their own feels empty and pointless. I'm not saying it can't be done. Some of you might be writing that down below. I've seen comic books in the past take a supporting character or a villain, send them on their own journey, and it's amazing. It's fascinating. But they have a little bit more room to work. A movie's this one's 2 hours. Oh God, it's 2 hours. If only it was an hour and a half at least. But you know, they have a little bit more room to work, and they're I'm sorry to say, more talented individuals who have a better grasp and understanding of the source material working on it. This, you know, it's a very hard task to do in the first place, and Sony is picking the worst possible people they could get to try and do it. Now, there is a faux Spider-Man here, an evil one, but the movie never bothers to explain why he feels the need to put on a knockoff Spider-Man suit. The character that he's supposedly playing, really in name only, in the comics did not wear a Spider-Man suit. A lot of this stuff is in name only. We'll talk about the Spider-Man lore with no spoilers in just a moment. But why also is it that nobody who can seem to see him when he puts his suit on except the 4 female leads? That was very inconvenient during the movie for our main characters, but also, why was that the case? And then for some reason, Ben Parker could see the guy in the suit. Why can he see it if no other civilians can? That's right, young Uncle Ben is in this movie, and so is Mary Parker, Peter Parker's mother. At one point, there was a rumor going around that you might have heard that they would be central to the storyline of this film. And maybe at one point they were. But with this final film released in theaters, I can't believe it's playing in theaters, it's weird. They have nothing to do with the main story. And it's weird to see name actors like Adam Scott and Emma Roberts in the background of the movie with nothing to do, playing very important characters. In fact, the script does so little with them that you would have to really know your Spider-Man lore to even notice and understand who they're truly playing. They never even are like, oh, look who it is. They're just like, oh, hey, Ben. And you're supposed to be like, Ben Parker? Ridiculous. There's a little bit of a funny nod at the end, but you're like, that's the end of the movie. You should have had that funny nod halfway through the movie. Like this movie is like if they took the first act of an origin story and made it the whole movie. And you're like, what? Speaking of Spider-Man lore, they make some changes here that are shocking in how unnecessary they are, how ridiculous they are, and how poorly they're executed. Like the movie often seems to use soap opera logic. It's as if soap opera writers were given the story of Spider-Man spin-off characters and asked to tell it. And that would turn out as bad as you would think it would. It's just really crazy. As for the acting, I still can't decide. I'd be curious to hear what you think. I can't decide if Dakota Johnson and now Sydney Sweeney can act. The jury's out on both of them, in my opinion. They both have certain qualities and charisma that do make them stand out, and very unique line readings. For instance, Johnson here, she could be quite funny, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally, but she gets the laughs. As for, and again, sometimes it was intentional, to her credit. She can do a good comedic line reading on occasion. More than occasion. I'd say 50% of the time, it was intentional. As for Sweeney, her role here is pretty muted. But, for instance, I recently saw Anyone But You, and I thought she did a fine job there. Maybe even bordering on good. It's weird, by the way, how she and Johnson are both so stilted physically and halting in their line delivery. Like, they have a very similar vibe. Come to think of it, Emma Roberts has a similar vibe, but I think the difference that sets her apart is that Roberts has more warmth and campiness to her, which I think helps smooth over, let's say, the rough edges of her acting ability. Celeste O'Connor and Isabella Merced are much more natural, and O'Connor manages to stand out as her character is a rule breaker. But Merced's role is just as muted as Sweeney's, and they kind of just stand there in the background. As for the fan favorite SpiderWomen that they're playing, like, these are major characters in the comics who did have their own lines and their own titles. But here, not one of them is more than 10% comics accurate, and they seem nothing like their respective characters. They're really just their characters in name only. Same for Tahar Rahim as Ezekiel, and he's just so awful. You would never guess he was a professional actor based on his work here, but he is. I just saw him in Napoleon, where he was fine. Again, he didn't blow me away, but he was fine. Here, awful, absolutely awful. I think any other actor would have been able to do a better job with this role. Scott, Mike Epps, and Zosia Mamet are all fine. They're all fine. But what the heck are they doing in this movie? When Zosia Mamet showed up, my audience, that's one of the points when they laughed, because they were like, how the heck did she get roped into this thing? Really, just when you think the Sony live-action Spider-Verse couldn't sink any lower, here comes Madam Web. And I've tried, I thought that Venom, the first Venom I enjoyed, because it was just so crazy and campy. The second Venom I thought was not good. I thought Morbius, I kind of understood what they were trying to do, and I enjoyed it for what it was. Like, with these movies, sometimes if you're a comic book fan like myself and you read the comics, you can kind of understand what they're trying to do. Your brain treats it as an Elseworld story, and you kind of go along with it. You can't even do that here. There's just nothing for anyone to latch onto. I'm baffled that it got through all the stages that a movie needs to get through. Like, so many people let this pass at so many different levels and checkpoints, and that somebody eventually said, you know what, let's stick it in theaters. So that's my review of Madam Web, hitting theaters on Valentine's Day to break the hearts of the still hopeful. There are some of you still left. Bless your hearts, but they're going to get broken on Valentine's Day if you go and see this movie. All right, share your thoughts down below, subscribe today, and of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.